have a guest that you love, and that is our resident expert on all thing Firebirds. This is a special bonus episode, full episode, because you'll hear some of this on Friday's show with the one and only Jason JD Hernandez, the voice of the Firebirds. We're doing a Coachella check-in on Locked On Kraken. I always forget.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken. As promised, we have Jason JD Hernandez joining us here because he is, of course, the voice of the Firebirds, and they have advanced yet again in the AHL playoffs. So we've got both of our affiliates still playing hockey, and since the Kraken aren't, we're leaning into it. JD, how you doing?
First off, I love your new intro, by the way. Love it a lot.
Pretty solid, right?
The last time we talked, I believe that even though you said the Kraken aren't in it, they still clobbered the Ducks big time.
This is true. Silver linings.
Yep. And at least we're meeting in our respective places and not KCI.
Yeah, exactly. Where you're like creeping up on me while buying your jersey. Speaking of, you have a Winter Classic jersey and you're wearing the Winter Classic threads. Now, I will say, as the Kraken expert in the bunch, those uniforms did not bring us much luck after January 1. I don't know if they were worse than the reverse retros, but still not great.
They're better than the reverse retros because at least they won a game in them.
Truly, that is true. Fair enough. And it was a pretty big one against Vegas, who is also not currently playing in the NHL playoffs. Just had to get that in.
You mean LTIR shenanigans don't work? The shock. I'm kidding. I don't want Vegas coming after me.
Oh, man. Well, good news is we don't really have to talk about Vegas at all on this podcast. And in fact, we're mostly going to lean into the AHL because we're going to talk about the Coachella Valley Firebirds. They take game one against a team you're pretty familiar with in the Ontario Reign. But again, we're going to focus on the Firebirds. JD, let's get your just kind of on-site reaction to that game.
I will say on site, I think Coachella Valley came out a little bit, slow, maybe the first couple of shifts. Once they got going, they really got going because Ontario had, I think, the first 5 or 6 shots on goal. And there was really a flurry of shots that happened about 2 to 3 minutes late in the first when they scored those 2 goals in very quick succession. So I think the key for the Firebirds now, get off to a fast start like they've been accustomed to every game, and don't take the foot off the gas. That's one key.
Yeah, I love that. And we're going to talk specifically about what they need to beat this Ontario team because I know you're familiar with them and we're with them actually in the same capacity that you're with the Firebirds. But, you talk about starting early, the Reign strike first, as you mentioned. Andre Lee scores first, but then to your point, it was Max McCormick and Devin Shore, who we know very well on Locked On Kraken, who got what a good friend of the podcast would call response goals. That meaning that the Coachella Valley Firebirds scored in quick succession within 2 minutes of each other, Max McCormick and Devin Shore, both collecting seconds. Exactly, both collecting their fourth of the playoffs. I mean, I feel like Max McCormick, captain of the team, has been solid, but it seems like in a short sample size that he really steps it up in the playoffs.
Absolutely. I mean, he stepped up in the playoffs last season, potting goal after goal, and he potted some important goals. Devin Shore, I think, is one of the best additions that the Firebirds could have because they add a little bit of that net front presence, also some much needed firepower. Shore obviously played for the Kraken earlier this season when he was up for a few games, I believe, right?
Yeah.
He was up for a few games. And I think the difference between this year's Firebirds team and last year's Firebirds team is there's a little bit more grit, a little bit more heavy hitting, which is what eventually wore them down last season. Now you have a great net front presence. And you can talk about veterans like Devin Shore. He's been there, done that, played in the NHL a number of times. Former Anaheim Duck, also Devin Shore, by the way. And he's been pulling through in this playoffs, and it really started in game 2 where he really got going in that Calgary series, which I guess we can probably talk about that like for a hot second, if I may.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
I feel that in that Calgary series, that 12-day layoff was kind of like that's a long time to be off, 12 days. And you could tell that there was rust in game 1. Once McCormick, especially McCormick, got going in game 2, then it was all Firebirds from there. And going into like game 3 and 4 of the previous series, they found ways to stop Dustin Wolf. I mean, they focused on going east-west, which, by the way, is something that they don't need to do against Eric Portillo. But for Dustin Wolf, get him moving left to right, get him off position. That's what they did. I mean, we saw that in that really crazy 7-5 game at Acrisure Arena last week. And even the closing game, it took that to stop Dustin Wolf. So McCormick, I think, has been one of the best facilitators on this team right now. But there's also someone else that I kind of want to focus on aside from Shorzy and McCormick, because I love both those guys. But I got to talk about Marion Studenic for a
Yeah.
hot second,
Yeah,
because
please.
he's very important on that penalty kill. He had an extremely important shorthanded goal earlier in this playoff. And to me, that was a catalyst. That was like breaking the dam open in that
Yeah.
previous series. So we cannot discount guys like Studenic.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. And just special teams overall, we know how important that is.
Mhm.
Power play was really solid for the Coachella Valley Firebirds throughout the season. Specifically in the Pacific Division, only the Condors had a better power play. Have a better power play in the playoffs. If you look at the regular season, Ontario actually had a really good power play. And so maybe that's something that we'll keep in mind as this series continues. But you mentioned the series against Calgary. We did get to talk to Jess Campbell, or I did get to talk to Jess Campbell before that series. And we still have that for our Locked On Kraken insiders. But I asked her about that, and of course the coach's response is there's benefits one way or another, especially on the flip side. The benefit of maybe having that rest is if you got a lot of folks hurt, and no one's 100% healthy in the playoffs. But it was interesting because at that same time, our ECHL affiliate had a layover. They did not have a bye through the first round. They did sweep, as it would turn out, the Tulsa Oilers right here. But they had about 7 days, I believe it was, away from game action. And Tato was very conscious of getting the team rest versus when they were on the ice, making the practice time short enough but intense enough so that their legs wouldn't feel too rubbery when they started getting back into games. And so, point taken against the Wranglers, dropped, that game, but then we're really able to bounce back in the series in a big way. So, coming up, I have the next segment as Driedger versus Daccord. And that's just because that's a massive, when you look at the differences between that team, that's very easy to point out. They kind of swapped positions. It's not a like for like because, of course, Driedger was hurt last year. But I want to talk about the differences and the similarities from your perspective on those two goalies playing for the Firebirds. But then
Oh God, we're doing this.
But then also to break down, some other things that make this Firebirds team just a little bit different than last year. That's coming up on this episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked on Kraken brought to you by our friends at Policygenius. Policygenius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It saves you time and money so you can provide your family with a financial safety net starting today. With Policygenius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for a $1 million coverage plan. Some options offer same day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. And Policygenius is great because you can compare your options from top companies, and a team of their licensed experts on hand will walk you through it. Your work life insurance policy may not offer you enough protection for your family's needs. And so Policygenius can give you an unbiased advice from licensed experts who have collected thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot from customers who found the best fit for their needs. Get life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policygenius. Head to policygenius.com/lockedonnhl or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/lockedonnhl. All right, JD, I'm putting you in the hot seat. We're here talking about the Coachella Valley Firebirds, our Coachella check-in here. Game 1 in the books. The Coachella Valley Firebirds able to take down the Ontario Reign. You mentioned that, the Reign struck first, but it was the Firebirds able to collect themselves back again. They get the 3-2 win in Game 1. I think if you look at some of the things, we just talked about the power play and the Reign having a really good power play in the regular season, the Firebirds having a better power play in the playoffs than they did in the regular season, but an 0-for-2 on the power play for the Firebirds. That being said, they held Ontario to only 1 power play success out of 3 chances. So let's dive in a little bit deeper on special teams.
Okay, I'm going to dive into that power play goal because that power play goal actually came on the very end of a 5-on-3. So going into that part of the game, Firebirds were up, and you could kind of sense that Ontario was just putting pressure on Chris Driedger, and they were. And Ontario, I think, in my perspective, I think Ontario has a more potent power play than Coachella Valley does. They have a little bit more of the firepower now that the Kings are out of the playoffs. You got Samuel Fagemo, who's back. You've got Hellenius, who's also good. Andre Lee has been a big surprise for the Ontario Reign the last couple of months. Very big-bodied, very skilled player. And then I also look at guys like Tyler Madden and Akil Thomas. Can we talk about Akil Thomas? I know this is Locked on Kraken, but I do want to talk about Akil Thomas for a hot second because this is a player that has worked his butt off the last 2 seasons. He was injured for almost the entirety of the 22 season. And he really worked his you-know-what off to get back to even some kind of decent playing shape 2 years ago. Last year was, I think, his coming out party. This year, he finally made his debut in the National Hockey League, got a couple of games in. But in the AHL right now, he is starting to tear it up. Very skilled player, very good at manipulating or helping manipulate that power play and getting those diagonal cross ice passes. He's very good at receiving and giving those passes. Something that the Firebirds have to watch out for is those cross ice passes. You got to get sticks on the ice. You have to maintain the pressure of, closing up lanes, clogging up lanes. That's going to be key for defending against the power play. For Ontario, it was a 5-on-3. Now, the Firebirds got a little bit lucky. I will say they got lucky in the sense that goal came only a couple of seconds after that first penalty had lapsed.
Yeah, 24 seconds. Yep.
Yes. So it was like a couple seconds. So it was literally like first player came out of the box. 2 seconds later, they scored. And everyone on the bench is looking like, are you sure that's time? Like, yes, we're sure that's the time. Like, sorry, but you only get the 1 power play goal. Now it's even strength. So Firebirds, sigh of relief. But Ontario, I think, just has a terrific power play. And that's going to be a key for the Firebirds. Don't take too many penalties against this team. They're they're up there for a reason as far as power play. They were ranked among the top 10 in the league in power play for a reason. They
Right.
have the firepower. So as long as, I mean, I hate to say this, but Max, please stay out of the box. Like, I love you, but don't visit my box,
Yeah.
Max.
Yeah, well, it wasn't Max in game one, so
No, it
he
wasn't.
paid heed to your advice at least in game one. We'll see how it goes. So
No,
again,
I
you
love El
mentioned
Capitan.
you mentioned the power play. We're going to talk a little bit more about some keys, but that's definitely going to be one. I think both of us have already alluded to that. Spoiler alert for the next segment. But I want to get back to what we wanted to talk about here. And I think, first of all, a lot of Seattle Kraken fans, especially those who listen to Locked On Kraken, are very interested to see what's going to happen with Chris Driedger in the long term. And a part of that, I think, depends on how he's able to perform at Coachella Valley. But the question I have for you, JD, is if you had to compare last year's run, which of course Joey Daccord, we know he put in a heavy workload, and this year's run, where just now you said because of being on the PK. And again, Seattle Kraken fans, unfortunately, know this very well, and maybe putting a little bit too much stress on our goaltenders, either throughout the PK or certainly late in the PK. What would you say, even outside of special teams, are the similarities and the differences when you have Driedger backstopping the Firebirds and when you had Daccord backstopping the Firebirds?
I'm going to do my best here. So I think Joy Daccord last year went on a magical run. And I mean, this is someone that worked very hard to get to where he is. You know, obviously coming out of the USPHL, a league that I also work for, then going to ASU, and then Coachella Valley. For Joy Daccord, he's a little bit more athletic than Chris Driedger. I mean, Joy Daccord, I think, gave us a little bit more not heartburn, but he made us a little bit nervous sometimes last season when he would, you know, have goalie adventures. And by that, I mean go out of the crease a little bit more than Driegs does. So I think that's one difference. Joey does like to play the puck a little bit. Although, did you notice in game one, did y'all notice, Kraken fans, that Driegs actually took a shot on the other goal with about 25 seconds left in regulation? Driedger had the puck on his stick and decided to go for it.
Might as well just go for it.
And there was a high stick that was not called, by the way. I forget which Ontario Reign player, but he like had the stick way up in the air and batted it 10 feet off. And they didn't call high sticking, by the way, but neither here nor there. And that prevented a shot from Driegs to try for an empty netter. And me in the box, I'm yelling like, "Oh my God, are you crazy?" Like it's a 1-goal game. But Joey, I think, would be a little bit more chaotic because Joey tried that way more than that was the first or second time I've seen Driegs try that all season long. And I think that speaks for he's a little bit more controlled in his area. I want to say that Driegs, especially the last 10 games, his rebound control has improved greatly. And I think that's what some teams are trying to exploit. They're trying to exploit just crashing the net and trying to find rebounds. When in fact, there was a multitude of times, especially last game, where there wasn't those rebound chances for Ontario, which is why they weren't like finding any opportunities up front. I mean, the Coachella Valley Firebirds, they were the ones crashing the net. Like that's what they should be doing. Ontario, the best way for them to get past Driegs is to just screen them, like find all kinds of screens. So, I mean, I don't know if that's quite answering the question here, but I think when you talk about comparing the two goalies, Driegs is a little bit more controlled, has a lot of composure, but I think that comes to his NHL experience that he's had before.
Yeah.
He has been there. He has been a number one goalie in the past. Yeah, I mean, that one's hard to answer, Erica. That really is.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I posed it, because I think the scenarios are different for each individual goalie. I think you really hit it on the head that Joey Daccord is still very much a work in progress. And for my money, I like that he's a little bit more aggressive. I like that he seems to be one of the most vocal goaltenders that we have throughout the entire system. I
Yeah.
like that he's willing to take those chances, especially because I don't like how our system sets up defense. And when you have a
Mhm.
goaltender that is going to be vocal, when you have a goaltender that's going to be active, when you have a goaltender that's going to take chances, you have to be on high alert defensively. And do I mean just the blue liners? No, I mean the team as a whole.
Ooh, you brought something up that I actually want to talk about later. Um, it's funny that you mentioned that organizationally, like defense is a key. I think it's more of an issue for the Kraken than it is for the Firebirds, because the Firebirds are actually like fairly. I think the Firebirds are better defensively this season
I
than
would
they were
agree.
last season.
Well, because to your point, well, we talked about this before, but last year we would see the Firebirds presumably en route to beating the brakes off of teams, and then they would peter out late in the game.
Mhm.
And by peter out, maybe it was a fitness thing or just a fatigue thing. That's of course possible, especially in a long season. But for my money, again, I think that overwhelmingly it was definitely, even if those other two things were factors, it was definitely a mentality thing and taking your foot off the gas, feeling a little bit too comfortable. And more
Mhm.
often than not, when you're feeling comfortable, the thing that slides the most is defense, because defense
Yeah.
is hard work.
But this team is more disciplined than they were last season.
Love
And
it.
I think a little bit of that, and I'm gonna fuel this fire for the Kraken fans. I think a little bit of that has to do with coaching. Imagine
Ooh.
imagine having a coach like Dan Bilesma. I'm just saying. I'm
Listen,
I'm
we've
just
already talked about it. I've been talking about it really since Bilesma was announced, because that was
Mhm.
a lot of the speculation early on. Like, hey, giving Dan this opportunity with a new AHL franchise, is that an on ramp to the NHL? And we're definitely going to have you back at the end of the Firebird season, because we're going to have to talk about that. But
I know.
what I've also said on Locked on Kraken, and it would hurt my heart while also making me overjoyed at the same time, is that the Seattle Kraken don't have one coaching staff opening. We have two,
Oh
if you
boy.
know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
If you know what I
Let's
mean.
not talk about that yet.
We're not
Let's
going to
not
talk
go
about
there
it.
yet.
We're not going to talk about it on this episode, but I
Oh,
appreciate. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna answer the one other question that you had before
Go
we
for
move
it.
on to the other segment,
Go
because I
for it.
still see Dreeks versus Daccord.
Yes.
What's going to happen with Chris Driedger after this season?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. We are
He
not
is
moving on until you chime in on this one. This is a big
he is
one
a
for
free
him.
agent.
Yeah.
He has been very good. He is starting to get the fans to chant his name, Driedger, Driedger. By the way, Firebirds fans, Driedger, Driedger. Let's keep that going. I have this feeling in the pit of my stomach that someone is going to offer him a pretty solid contract somewhere.
Mm,
But I I would love to see him, like, selfishly, I would love to see him stick around,
yeah,
because he's been a big difference maker for the Firebirds this season,
I would
and he's a
agree.
bit more polished. But at the same time, I get that every player wants to go on to the National Hockey League,
Sure.
and especially for someone like Dreeks, who has been there before.
Yeah.
And if he got an NHL job somewhere, I'd be remiss if I didn't take it. And
Yeah.
this is a contract year, so I'm sure there's a lot of teams that are watching this playoff run again, going, maybe we need him as a backup. Maybe we need him as an insurance policy on our end, because there's a plethora of NHL teams right now that are looking for a solid backup goalie that have absolutely nothing in their pipeline. Nothing.
Yeah, I think it's a really excellent point. And I think also for Driedger, the importance of this season, even though it's not where he wanted to be, he expressed that
Mhm.
during training camp. He expressed that he wanted to be in the NHL. But what we also saw is that he maintained his health, which hasn't happened when he's been with the Seattle Kraken. So
Yeah, not in 4 years, actually.
yeah. I
Oh
mean,
my
and to
god.
your point about someone gonna offer him up, that's how the Kraken got him from Florida, right?
Yep.
So I think it's gonna be interesting. But I want you to think about this as we do our quick little segue here. Jack LaFontaine. Thoughts on that? And then we'll talk more keys to taking down the Ontario Reign. That's coming up on this special episode, Checking In with Coachella, featuring Jason JD Hernandez. Today's episode of Locked on Kraken is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also, what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED lights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber and not cash, my friends. With all the parts you need, and the prices that you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only, available for U.S. customers. All right, JD, I want to stick with goaltending a little bit here because we've seen a few goaltenders, and Jack LaFontaine is not with the Firebirds at the moment. He's with the Mavericks, but he's someone that you did get to see a little bit with the Firebirds. And the reason I want to talk about Jack is because we also are keeping up with the Kansas City Mavericks. Also, though, as you mentioned, he's not with the Firebirds because who is?
The Kansas City Mavericks are still in the Kelly Cup playoffs. Probably my pick to win the whole thing, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, they're looking good. Tattoohead has them in a good spot. They'll play today, Friday, for those watching this bonus episode the day it goes live. And they're looking solid. And between Morris and LaFontaine, they look really good. I think Morris does a little bit more of the heavy lifting, at least right now, for the Mavericks. But when I say more of the heavy lifting, it's literally one game. They're getting even time. But if let's assume that Driedger does move on, because I think that's a high probability, especially given what his goals are. Do you think that LaFontaine could make a good future goaltender at an AHL club, given what you saw from him? I mean, if I remember correctly, his first action with Coachella Valley, he got peppered pretty hard in the first period.
Thanks for bringing that memory back. Peppered is a light way to put it. I'm so sorry, buddy. No, it was just a hard game that he was in. That was a situation where he had to go in because the Firebirds didn't have anyone else. If you remember, there was all kinds of injuries, and Driedger was up backing up Joey Daccord. And Stetska also got hurt. I think people forget that Stetska had an injury right before Christmas time where he got barreled over.
Yeah.
So our two goalies were the two goalies for the Mavericks right now, LaFontaine and Morris. And by the way, LaFontaine was up during the holidays, so I called him Fa La 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 LaFontaine.
Oh man.
Sorry, Jack.
Oh man. But yeah, I mean, I just have LaFontaine on the mind because again, just spoke to Tattoohead today, but between we're taking Driedger out of the picture for a minute here. I think we have to also take Daccord out of the picture because I like him with the Kraken. But you mentioned Stetska, LaFontaine, Morris, and is it Kako, right? So What do you see as the future for the Firebirds, or just for the organization overall in net?
So I will say after those first like few minutes, like after that little bit of a rough hiccup for LaFontaine, he remains pretty calm and wound up getting a very important win against a certain goalie that is still in the NHL playoffs right now, by the way.
Mm.
And I remember this specifically because I talked about this with a Vancouver buddy of mine. He beat Artur Silovs, who is tearing it up in Vancouver right now. In your mind, you got to go, I did like, if I'm Jack LaFontaine and I'm watching the Oilers Canucks series and I'm seeing Vancouver up, and I'm sure he's watching in his room. I'm sure he is because, who doesn't love watching that series? I bet he's going like, oh yeah, Silovs.
Hmm.
I beat him earlier this season.
Huh.
Yeah, you did, buddy. I love that Jack LaFontaine did not give up on a lot of plays. He never got down on himself. And I think that's something that I loved about him when he was down in Coachella is I never saw him slump his shoulders. I never saw him look down after giving up a goal. Like he would quickly analyze it, very quickly analyze it and go, okay, that happened. Okay, moving on. You got to have a short memory with that.
Mhm.
And I think that's why I'm really going to love having LaFontaine if he winds up being the backup goalie in Coachella Valley to Stetska. Then I can't think of anyone better that's already currently in the system.
Right.
And I would prefer him over Cale Morris personally. But yeah, LaFontaine beating Seelofs earlier this season, that's got to be a tip on your cap. And that was an overtime win, by the way.
Yeah, it
Against
was
the
it was
Abbotsford
a tight. That
Canucks.
was a kind of wild game. It was, but the Firebirds did what they had to do and get the win. And I think that's another thing that I really like about this Firebirds team. You talked about the discipline, but I also think there's a level of composure, and maybe those two at some point there's a tipping point to where they're different, but there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of overlap, and I think the composure, the discipline is there, and grit, as you mentioned, not just in that they can be a physical team, but sometimes you have to overcome what another team is throwing at you. I mean, a lot of times you have to do that. You're not always going to be in the driver's seat. And I think that's the difference from last year's Firebirds team to this year's Firebirds team. A lot of time spent in the driver's seat last year. And so when the adversity came, especially late in the season, and by that I mean in the playoffs, it was unfamiliar terrain. Whereas we talked about this on Locked On Kraken, because the Firebirds and the Kraken started off a little bit rocky coming out of training camp, and the expectations were super high for both sides. And in the first handful of games, it was like, well, are we going back to season one, at least for the Kraken? So I think that's going to be interesting, and that's going to be something that can really push the Firebirds over the edge. But before we close out with you, JD, at least in this episode, not officially a crossover, because now you're on this side, right? You're on the family side of things. But before we end the family reunion episode, that's what we'll start calling these, the family reunion episodes. Before we end our family reunion episode, we talked about special teams and how important that's going to be for this battle, which, I mean, of course, you can say that for every postseason at any level, right? But we also know the Reign are very good. They were very good in the regular season on the power play in particular. But what are some other keys? Let's have this focused on the Firebirds. How do they need to play? When they're playing their best, what do they look like? And what are you expecting them to see if they want to meet success in this series?
Okay, I'm going to start with a couple of keys. 1, stay out of the box. 2, do not take your foot off the gas when you have the lead.
All gas, no brakes. Let's go.
If that's the case, it's going to be like 7-1.
All right.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Number 3, and I think this is going to be an important key, is clog up lanes. Buckle down on the defense. I mean, to me, that one's important too, because Ontario is a very, they're a chess team. And by that, I mean, they will try to look at like 2 passes ahead.
Yeah.
And try to look for those tic-tac-toe plays, which I think is a fault to Ontario. Right. There's been times this season, and I've said this in Ontario, Stop being fancy.
Right.
Stop being cute. You don't have to be cute.
Just be effective. That's really interesting. I love that you
Yeah.
said that because a lot of times people like seeing that kind of hockey, right? Because it's fun. You effectively undress someone, right? You make them look a little foolish, and there's a time for that. Again, it makes the crowd go wild, especially if you're playing in front of a home crowd. And there's a tipping point. You do a little bit too much of that. And to your point, that's where if the Firebirds can clog up the lane, then they're intercepting that. And I think that's huge. But that goes back to not just the discipline, but what we talked about defensive effort. You have to be on point defensively. Your job on defense is to stop the other team from doing what they want to do. That you can do that in multiple ways by getting into their body, going stick to stick, body to body, getting into lanes and anticipating the passes, or more so getting into lanes. It creates it so that the first look that your opponent wants is not an option. And some of the best defensive teams, talking about chess, some of the best defensive teams are so good at their scout and taking away what they know their opponent wants, and also only giving the opponent what they know they can defend. And that's the next level for the Firebirds.
This is why I gave a little bit of love to Marian Studenichu. I feel like people don't talk about him enough. Like, no, like we got to give the man his flowers for a second. Studenichu, aside from that shorthanded goal, one aspect of his game that I like, especially on the PK, is he does know how to get in lanes. He knows how to use the active stick. He did this a couple of times last series and once last game, at least once, maybe more, where he's very good at lifting the stick, lifting the opponent's stick. Just to me, he's one of those players that does a lot of the little things to prevent, whatever goals you have on the power play, especially. So I think that's why I gravitate towards players like that, is the ones that do the little things, the ones that don't get all the attention, but I think deserve a little bit more. So guys like Studenic up there, Riker Evans, obviously you guys know in Seattle, like very good defensively. Yes. And Cale Fleury also, by the way, like don't forget about Cale Fleury.
Don't forget about Fleury.
Give that man his flowers too.
I love it. I love it.
I know we're talking about the big guns. You know who we didn't talk about in this episode?
Who?
We haven't said the name Shane Wright.
I know. Well, he was one of the guys in the box. I did see that pop up. Yeah, but you know what? I'm glad we mentioned Shane Wright because, of course, a lot of people have questions about Shane Wright. And on today's regular episode of Locked On Kraken, again, this is a bonus episode, but we heard from Jared McCann. And McCann was asked a question. He didn't really answer the question he was asked, but he was asked a question about some of the younger guys coming up late to the Seattle Kraken being a quote unquote tryout. He had used that terminology earlier. And so between how some of the young guns, that's the last time we did our family reunion. The last time we did a family reunion, we were talking about some of the let the kids play, right? So between the time that the kids spent in Seattle versus what you're seeing in Coachella Valley, who are some of the players that you think have done enough in their quote unquote auditions to be given high consideration by the time these two organizations and a few members of the Mavericks get to training camp in the fall?
I got two names for you.
All right.
One, Shane Wright. Two, Logan Morrison.
Ooh.
Why are we not talking about Logan Morrison a little bit more? Another guy that does the little things. Another guy that gets into the dirty areas.
Lomo, let's go.
Another guy that doesn't get the glory of the goals, but gets some very important apples in pretty much every win that the Firebirds have had.
I like it.
So I think those are two names to keep an eye on, folks. Shane and Lomo.
I love it. We talked about Lomo. Poor Lomo. They were trying to feed him so bad. It was adorable. He has
such a good attitude.
I love it. Well, Jason JD Hernandez, we know, hey, you're still doing the postseason things, and we appreciate your service to the Coachella Valley Firebirds, making sure everyone's fired up in Acrisure Arena. Let the folks know where they can find you and how they should tap into the next Firebirds game.
Let's see. They can find me between the boxes, not talking to the players during games. They can find me between the boxes as the public address voice for the Coachella Valley Firebirds. Every game during this playoff, where I'll be saying Firebirds goal a lot. I'm going to say it loud just once for all the Kraken fans out there that don't get to come down to Coachella Valley. I will do it once just for y'all. Firebirds goal!
Let's go. So excited.
And so they'll see me down between the boxes during the games. You can also find me on Locked On Ducks, where I talk about the Ducks as well. For those of you so inclined that want to hear about Ducks talk and whatnot, you can find me on the Twitter sphere and the socials at StimpyJD. Why StimpyJD? I'll tell you why. Because of a little cartoon called Ren and Stimpy. So it's StimpyJD. The show's Twitter X is at LO_Ducks, and just find me on there and let's have some fun. And
I love it.
by the way, this is coming out Friday afternoon, right?
Yes.
So since this is coming out before the Firebirds game, if you want a free, I don't want to do advertising here, but I will just say there's been like some shenanigans between both teams, and there's free stuff available for Firebirds fans. So I'm not going to advertise here, but
Just go for it. Go for it.
No, so okay. So the Ontario Reign are doing a mobile blackout giveaway at a car wash that I'm not going to name. But they're doing a mobile thing in Palm Desert. So to respond to that, Grand Prix Car Wash is offering free car washes Friday only to anyone wearing Firebirds gear.
There you go. There you go. We'll put that clip up on socials. If you got a dirty car, you know how to get, you know where to go. Well, JD, thank you so much. We have a new term for now for when we talk Coachella Valley. We're going to have a family reunion, I'm sure, for as long as the Firebirds are in the playoffs, which we hope is at least as long of a run as it was last year. If it's shorter, we sure hope that we come out on top. But we will let you get to it. And again, once it's officially the off season, we're going to circle back to those coaching vacancies with Seattle and perhaps what that could mean for the Firebirds. But for Jason, JD, Hernandez, Erica L. Ayala, your host of Locked On Kraken, reminding you to be kind to yourself, be kind to one another, hold fast, stay true. Let's go Kraken, and let's get fired up for the Coachella Valley Firebirds. All right. Peace out, everybody.
Fuel the fire.
They can still hear you, you know.
I know.